Welcome to this week's Walk Thru Voices, where our team from Walk Thru the Bible is reading with you through the daily walk reading schedule, and we're just sharing some of what we're seeing and learning and experiencing from God's Word with you. If you're following along in the daily walk schedule, maybe listening to the daily walk podcast, this week we're reading or listening to Job chapter 20 through chapter 37. Last week we were in Job chapter 1 through verse 19, and we pick up in chapter 20 this week through chapter 37. You know, the story of Job begins with a lot of suffering in Job's life. There was a conversation that happened between God and the accuser, or Satan, about whether Job was faithful to God because of all of the blessing and abundance from God in Job's life. And that was Satan's rationale for why Job was so faithful. And God allowed Satan to bring pain and suffering into Job's life. And Job experienced quite a bit of suffering, the loss of family, the loss of possessions, the loss of health. And that's how the story begins. Suffering and pain, hurt. And then some friends show up in Job's life. They first sat with him in silence and mourning for a period of time. And then Job breaks the silence and begins to question. And then the friends begin to speak. And we saw from chapter 3 through chapter 19, and then we picked up the conversations between Job and his friends in chapter 20 as we began reading this week, as his friends really begin to accuse Job of unrighteousness. They sort of have this argument. They basically say, you know, God is entirely just. God is entirely in control. God rewards righteousness. God punishes wickedness. And so because Job is experiencing suffering, Job must have been unrighteous. Job is trying to defend himself and defend his case. And you just read all of this conversation that happens between Job and his three friends. We pick it up as we start in chapter 20 of this week. And as you read this story, you might have even noticed, it seems as if Job is on this like emotional roller coaster. He's trying to reconcile what he's been experiencing with what he believes or what he wants to believe about God. And it's just heartbreaking to read through these chapters. But then in chapter 32, something is added to the story. There's a fourth friend that shows up. Job and his three friends have had this dialogue, and then at chapter 32, verse 1, here's what we read. So these three men stopped answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. But Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite, from the family of Ram, became very angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. He was also angry with the three friends because they had found no way to refute Job and yet had condemned him. Verse 4, now Elihu had waited before speaking to Job because they were older than he, but when he saw the three men had nothing more to say, his anger was aroused. So the narrator inserts this new character into the story, Elihu, who sits in silence as he waits for Job and his three friends to stop talking. And Elihu is frustrated. He's frustrated with Job because Job was more interested in defending his own righteousness than anything else. And he's frustrated with the friends because the friends are condemning Job of being unrighteous and can't quite explain how that all makes sense. And then he begins to speak. And from chapter 32 through the end of our reading this week, chapter 37, is a single speech from Elihu. And his argument goes something like this. God is just. We all agree to that. God operates the world on principles of justice. But Elihu begins to question, begins to speculate that maybe Job's suffering, maybe the source of Job's suffering is for some other purpose. Maybe it's as a means of disciplining Job because of his self-righteousness. Maybe it's for reasons that we can't even understand or explain. But one thing that Elihu is certain of, that we can't accuse God of being unjust because of suffering. And we get to the end of chapter 37, and Elihu finishes his speech. And then in 38, God is going to begin to speak. And often when we read the book of Job, we read the first few chapters where there's the suffering and the sitting in silence in the morning and the beginning of the speeches from the friends. And then we almost want to rush all the way to chapter 38 when God begins to speak. But I don't want you to rush past the end of chapter 37 too fast. I think the narrator, as he's telling the story of Job, wants us to feel something at the end of verse or chapter 37. Think about everything we've read. There's been suffering and silence, Job's complaint, the friends' accusations, Job trying to defend himself, Job demanding an explanation from God and not hearing it, and Elihu shows up on the scene and corrects everyone and still is unable to explain Job's suffering. And 37 chapters into this book, nothing is resolved. The questions are still unanswered. The ways of God, still mysterious. The hurt, the pain that Job is feeling, it's still real. 37 chapters in, and everything in the story is still unsettled. You know, I wonder if maybe we feel that in our life sometimes. You know, moments or seasons of hurt and suffering, and we go pretty far into the story, and everything still feels unsettled, unresolved. Maybe you're walking with some friends or family through that season right now. And my question, I think, is, as I've been reading through this story again with you, is what are we supposed to feel? What are we supposed to do when we get to the end of chapter 37? What does Job's story teach us at this point where everything is still unsettled and unresolved? Here's what I'm learning. I'm learning that more than we should try to explain or rationalize God's actions, which we can't always seem to do, we can trust in God's character and trust in God's wisdom. You know, in suffering, in seasons of pain or in hurt, especially when there is the perception of innocent suffering, we are naturally inclined to try to explain or to rationalize God. We want answers, don't we? We are rational creatures who thrive on discovery and thrive on explanations, and we want to explain it all. We want to rationalize the way God is operating in the world, and yet perhaps God is wanting to remind us that we won't always have those answers. We won't always have those explanations. And even when we try, sometimes our answers, sometimes our explanations are just absolutely wrong. But we can be confident that God is trustworthy, that God is just, that God is loving, that God is fully in control. And of that we can be certain. And I hope that truth, that reminder, is a source of encouragement for you. If you're walking through a season of difficulty and pain and suffering and are feeling that you are where Job is at the end of chapter 37, our explanations may fall short, but the character of God, that He is trustworthy and just and loving and fully in control, of that we can always be certain.